traveling on the train.
Hi, welcome. My name is Ashish Kaushal. I'm the co-founder of Consciously Unbiased and CEO of HireTalent. We have a great show today. It's about colorism and the colorism blind spot. Merriam-Webster defines colorism as prejudice or discrimination, especially within a racial or ethnic group, favoring people with light skin over those with dark skin. We will discuss how colorism impacts bias and opportunities in the workplace. We have special guests today, Melva LaJoy Jones. She's CMP, founder of LaJoy Plans. David Ryan Castro, founder of Amplify RJ, and then Dimitri, Moïse, co-founder and vice president of Claim Our Space Now. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you.
Can we start off by having you say who you are, what you do, and share an example of how colorism has impacted you? Melva, would you like to start?
Sure, I'm happy to start. And hi to everybody in the virtual space. Great to imagine what you look like today. Again, my name is Melva LaJoy Jones, and I own a boutique events firm here in Washington, D.C., which I've had for 14 years. But let's talk about colorism. So what comes up for me is remembering a movie by Spike Lee, School Days, and seeing that movie and seeing myself, someone who is brown-skinned, depicted in that movie intentionally as more activist-oriented, and seeing the individuals who were light-skinned depicted as feminine and beautiful and the women you really wanted to be around. So translate that to my life. When I was a little girl, there weren't a lot of images that looked like me. Now, my mother absolutely tried through affirmations of Black beauty, but it wasn't sufficient for me. And so for many years as a kid, I would pull my hair out to the point of being bald because I never felt good enough, right? And how that impacted me in my work in the early stages of my career is I would shrink myself. I would hide my Blackness to the extent that I thought was available, my brown skin, because there were messages that this brown skin wasn't appropriate for the workplace. And so I constantly struggled with, how do I tone that down? Do I straighten my hair? Do I wear something that's not as bold as what I'm wearing today? And so I think that is a struggle that many humans, but I, as a brown-skinned woman, faced for quite some time.
Wow, such an amazing story. And it kind of highlights the fact that we really have to get to a point in society where we get to think about people as they're different like me rather than different than me, because I think that's the way to sort of receive each other better. David, I'd love to hear your story as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me. My name is David Ryan Barcega Castro-Harris, all 5 names for all the ancestors. I am, and I think that's important to introduce myself, especially when we're talking about this topic, right? As a biracial person who is Black and Filipino, like I get different experiences of colorism, right? When I am in Black spaces, I'm more light-skinned, right? And so I often get the, you are so articulate, right? You, like you're well-spoken, you're educated, you're professional so many times because of other intersections of my identity that we'll talk about later, I'm sure. Like with the education that I have, the economic privilege that I grew up with, like I am often perceived as not as threatening, right? When I'm in Black spaces or around other Black people, right? And outsiders see me as a friendlier Black, if you will. And then when I'm in Filipino spaces, right, lots of Filipinos have the same complexion that I do. And there are a lot of people who, like my mother included, right, who are lighter skinned. And there's so much prejudice around being darker skinned because you're outside, you're working. There's just so much tied up in that. And so it's a unique experience getting it from both ends.
Do you find yourself like when you're within the Black community, they don't consider you Black, they consider you Filipino, and when you're in the Filipino community, they consider you Black?
It largely depends on the relationships. Being ethnically ambiguous is a blessing and a curse depending on where you are. I can't say it's one way or the other.
Okay. Dimitri, welcome. I'd love to hear your background and your story and how colorism has affected you.
Sure. Thank you for having me, Ashish. And it's great to virtually see everyone. I am coming to you live from the land of the Lenape, also known as Queens, New York. My name is Dimitri Moïse. As Ashish said, I'm co-founder and vice president of Claim Our Space Now, a young nonprofit organization. We were founded in the wake of the horrific murder of George Floyd, and our mission is to actively encourage and embolden anti-racism, as well as dismantle white supremacy to save all Black lives. And we do that through a number of different ways. But more about me and how colorism has affected my life. Similar to David, as someone who is a light-skinned son of immigrants, my parents come from Haiti. I am Haitian American. I have also been called. I've also been called words such as disarming. That's something that has always stuck with me. People call me that and say, you know, you're so able to break into these spaces because you're disarming to a group of white people. I also think of my own privilege, particularly as a Haitian. In Haiti, it is very common for dark-skinned Haitians to be looked down upon, whereas those who are lighter-skinned are obviously more of the bourgeoisie. And I think of my mother, who is very light skinned. She has white skin and freckles. And my dad, who is much darker. And I find that very, very interesting. They come from different parts of how society looks upon light skinned and darker skinned Black people in Haiti. In a former life, I was an actor. I still do a lot of acting today. And I remember one experience. I was going in for a show, it was my first show on Broadway. And I remember people telling me before my audition, oh, you know, you're really light-skinned and this show doesn't really hire light-skinned people. Maybe you should look at Motown. That's more your speed. I ended up getting hired for the job, but that was kind of just the first of many experiences. On the show I was with, my nickname was Light Skin. They would call me that on stage. And it's interesting because in Black spaces, growing up, I was called white. And in white spaces, I was never accepted. And so I needed to find ways to survive. And part of that was subconsciously using my light skin privilege to survive and to be in the groups that were considered cool. Similarly, I come from a more privileged background, and my education also, you know, inspires people to call me articulate and hear my parents speak in French, Haitian accents and then tell me, wow, for someone who has parents from Haiti, I mean, you speak so well. Meanwhile, I'm going to the same schools as all your kids, and I was born in America. And I find that very interesting as well. So I'm excited to get into this conversation because I understand that I'm coming into this space with a certain level of privilege that is important to recognize, because I think that is one of the biggest ways we can combat colorism and how that lives within the spectrum of racism as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, you brought up some things I could relate to because I grew up in Connecticut, and there's two pieces of that. So they would call me Indian in Connecticut, but then when I go to India, they call me American. So I didn't really feel a sense of belonging. But then in Connecticut, because I grew up in a very white town, people would say I was white. And it wasn't out of like a racist thing. It was just to have me belong in their circle and figure out how they can identify with them. But the reality is it just minimizes you, you know? And so like, even when people say, I don't see color, that's saying you don't see me, you know? And I think that's not the right way to deal with things, but it's not always coming from a bad intent. So speaking of that, do you guys think colorism or the preference for lighter skin is more prevalent in people of the same race or other races?
I think I'll start. My perspective is that it lives within races because that's how we were taught. So I'll come into this conversation as a Black human, right? But I can trace my heritage to my great grandmother who was a field slave. And why was she a field slave? My great grandmother was very dark, probably 3 or 4 shades darker than myself, right? And we know the history of this country. There's so much literature out there that was intentional, that the brown skin, dark skin were workers, and that the light skin, and if they had European features, for lack of a better term, were allowed in the big house, right? And so I think that colorism is intergenerational because from generation to generation to generation, that message has been reinforced, be it in family conversations, be it in media. I can remember going to Howard University, liking a gentleman who would be considered light-skinned, and his mother horrified that he would date me, and let alone if he would take me seriously. And she told me, this is a Black woman telling another Black woman, you're very nice, you're very articulate, but you're too brown, and we can't ruin the color in our family. She flat out told me. So I think we were taught to have it as a way of being Black in America, I would say. I think also we see it, though, the privilege outside of our racial group, right?
Yeah.
Where we get hired, what we see, and you're going to hear me say it again, what we see initially on TV. Who is lauded as beautiful or educated or somebody we should aspire to be is the byproduct of generations ago. So that's what I would say.
Yeah. I would say, adding on to that, you know, especially in America, I think the racial categorization is something that's so unique, and Black people have been looked at as subhuman since the beginning of American society. And so I think because it starts at Black people being looked at as subhuman, I think that starts a more layered, complex look at the racial categorizations that exist here, like a case system. The lighter you are, the closer you are, the more proximity you have to the power structure, to the power of American society. And I think of my experience as an actor, and colorism, I think, runs rampant within the Broadway community. And, you know, theater is looked at as one of the most progressive places, right? Theater is pushing the boundaries of creating the world that we want to see. And one of the shows that I was on, and going on to, you know, the hiring of light-skinned humans, Black humans versus darker skin, there was a show that I was on where there were 2 significant roles for women of color. One was the secretary in the building where everyone is working, usually has kind of the, you know, is the comic relief in a way for the show. The second character was a mistress character of one of the lead characters, who was a white man. And time again, you would see a lighter skinned woman being hired for that mistress role, right? And you would see the darker skinned woman consistently being cast as the secretary in the show. And I think that subconsciously gives, you know, there are thousands of people seeing these shows. And I think subconsciously that gives people the idea that, I see darker skinned person as the secretary, I see lighter skinned person as the desirable mistress, that is how I should see those people in society across multiple sectors, whether that's being hired in different industries, whether that's going in for a show, whether that's applying to prestigious programs. I think media plays a really huge part in people wanting to see themselves represented. And when they don't see themselves represented, I think that makes people feel that they don't deserve to be represented. And I know that even as a light-skinned person, I would shrink myself. And sometimes I find myself, I have to catch myself. Sometimes I think it's a lifelong thing that at least I feel like I need to wrestle with. I still find myself sometimes shrinking who I am. And so I think it's, at least part of my responsibility to know that these spaces I'm able to infiltrate, when we create space for the most marginalized among us, I believe we create space for everyone. And so I think it's really our job to create entry points and spaces for people who are made to be historically disenfranchised.
Absolutely. I agree.
Oh, that's so good.
Yeah. And I think when you create spaces for the marginalized, you actually create opportunity for everybody,
Absolutely. I was thinking, one, Dimitri, I wanted to thank you for introducing yourself with the place that you're at, right? Being unceded, a territory of indigenous folks. I'm just outside of Los Angeles in Pico Rivera, California, which is the unceded land of the Tongva people who were twice colonized, right? And this is because of white supremacy and colonialism. And so when you ask whether this is something that's happening inside of a racial group or outside, I think it's both, right? We're talking about proximity to whiteness and white supremacy, and thinking about white supremacy not just as, did I say the N-word today, or did I go on a march with the Proud Boys, but how have I privileged whiteness, right? This made up thing that is where we are concentrating power, privilege, wealth, opportunity, right? And everybody else, like Dimitri was saying, like Black people have been put at the bottom, have been dehumanized, but so have indigenous people, right? Not everybody who has white skin has always been included into whiteness, specifically here in the US. And I'm leaning on the work of the people from dismantlingracism.org, just to cite my sources verbally. But when the Irish first came to the United States, they were not included into the class and the privilege of whiteness, and then have since assimilated, right? When Italian people first came here, when Jewish people first came here, they were not seen as the standard of like Anglo-Protestant whiteness, right? And have since assimilated as whiteness continues to try to concentrate its power, right? And so when you're thinking about how this plays out within racial groups, the lighter you are, the easier it is for you to assimilate into whiteness. When you brought up like representation, I did this experiment with my friend Rochelle last week. She told me, open a private browsing window and Google the words "beautiful woman," right? And then image search. What comes up? About halfway down the page, you'll get to it's mostly white or lighter skinned people. And then about halfway down the page, you'll get to Zoe Kravitz, who is a Black woman. She's biracial, very light skinned. It takes you a lot longer to get all the way down to the first, like very obviously Black face, which is Lupita Nyong'o, who, beautiful woman. All the women on this page are beautiful, right? But like, why is it that you had to scroll most of the way down the page to get to a Black face, right? It's about this idea of whiteness and white bodiness being supreme, and that doesn't just play out in skin color, that plays out across so many different intersections.
Yeah, I also think, like what you said with the media is right. How we define people is how we even think about ourselves that way, right? I mean, I can give you an example. I was flying on a plane coming back from Miami back to New York, and a woman behind me stood up and said some pretty weird stuff, and pretty much implied that she was going to blow up the plane, right? And I looked back, and because she didn't look like me, I was like, oh, she's just crazy, But if she had looked like me, then I would have been scared that the person was accurate, because the way society is now painted brown people with terrorism, right? And so the reality is that it also affects our own psyche,
Yeah.
It absolutely does. And I wanted to speak, since I think I'm the only person that identifies as a woman in this forum, that it's been my experience that when people talk to me over the phone, because I have a unique accent, they assume, right, that I'm short, petite, white, light. And to David's point, when they see me, there's an initial response of trying to get comfortable that I didn't fit in their box. And so often what I hear is, I'm unexpected, or you're so articulate, or wow, that's great, you're brown and this.
Yeah.
And to your point, getting out of that frame for me, but also for them, is so challenging.
Absolutely.
And as a woman, I can tell you that for far too long, I tried to be that, right? So I pulled my hair. I straightened my hair, which essentially burns my scalp. I tried to be on diets. I tried to fit the box because of that Google search, because I want to be seen as beautiful, which impacts where I think I can be in my career.
100%.
Absolutely. And you think about the fact that, I mean, everything in this country is rooted in white supremacy. And I think the way to combat racism is to consistently be anti-racist and think about how I am working each day to be anti-racist. You know, you think of the beginning, and David, to cite this source, 1619 podcast, which y'all, if you haven't listened to it, what are you literally waiting for? We look at the beginning of American arts and culture, which is blackface. And white people blacken their skin to the point where, you know, it's as black as my microphone off screen. And they would use, you know, charcoal and ways to make themselves as black as possible. And intergenerationally, that sticks. You know, that was meant to make fun of the black race. I can't think of another, I can't think of something. I mean, that's just such a disrespectful way of dehumanizing a person. And so to see that and to know that blackface continued for decades, it's no wonder today that those of us who are darker skinned experience more discrimination, more racism, because it's literally embedded into our arts and culture.
Yeah. You know,
absolutely.
Racism, and I think some people kind of shy away from that. They say, I'm not racist, so that should be good enough. And I always say, you know, if you put it in perspective, let's say you went to school to pick up your child and you see another child being bullied, if you don't do anything, you're endorsing that movement, right? And so would you do that? No, you would actually get in front of them and say, stop bullying and separate the kids, right? So why wouldn't we be active as adults doing the same thing when you see something happening that's discriminatory? So it's a very simple thing to take on, which I don't think people realize because they don't associate it correctly on some level. You know?
It's simple, but it's really difficult, you know, for people, because of the fact, like you said, Melva, you're unexpected. People need to take time to be comfortable. And I think as adults, you know, obviously we forget who we were as kids, and we have to assimilate into a society where we need to be this perfect version of ourselves, which never shakes out good for anyone. And I think it's difficult because we are fearful of the things that we don't understand. We're fearful of the things that bring us extreme discomfort. I think we seek for comfort. We seek for people who look like us. We seek homogeny, and we have to really actively work at, okay, when I look around at my friend groups, do I keep multiracial circles? If I don't keep multiracial circles, and it's a goal of mine to have a multiracial community that I can lean on, what are the ways that I am trying to do that for myself? I think as much as we seek homogeny and as much as in-group preference lives in us, that means we have to do that much more work to lean into that discomfort and start to find communities outside of ourselves to build that cultural competency so that we don't have to feel that extreme discomfort when we're met with someone who feels unexpected to the ways in which we perceived they were going to be or how they were going to look.
Absolutely.
Well, and I think we have to normalize vulnerability, right? Doing the work, you can't do the work and not be vulnerable. And I think grace is our currency. I have a friend who identifies as he is 6'5", he is Swedish, and he has questions. And he's opted out of the conversation around diversity, colorism, racism, because he's so scared to do the work in a vulnerable way.
Yeah.
And he's scared that humans who identify of color won't meet him with grace. And so I think there has to be some give and take. We want people to do the work. I can't do the work for them, but we do have to be open to participating in their process.
Absolutely. I say that I love that you talked about vulnerability, because we always talk about strength and vulnerability in our trainings and our learning experiences. So I want to put the audience through an exercise, and I'd love for you guys to do this as well. It's kind of how to break the bias. So fill in this phrase: I am, but I am not. David, you want to go first?
And like with anything, right?
Yeah, because people make assumptions about you, right? Because like they might say, I am Indian, but I'm not good at something, right? Or as an example.
Yeah. If anybody wants to jump in before me, go ahead. I guess like I am young, but I'm not like naive.
Yep.
Oh, I needed the example. Thank you. So I've got it. I am Christian, but I am not perfect.
Love it.
Is that good?
Oh my God, this is so hard.
I had to write it down.
Okay. I am spiritual, but I'm not religious.
That's a good one too. You know, it's one of my coworkers. He's from Jamaica, and so he said, "I am Jamaican, but I don't smoke weed." Or I'm not a pothead, right? Because people assume those, right? The bias, the relationship between the two things. And so one of the exercises we do is to have people go through that experience. And when you hear that from each other, then you're like, oh my God, I did make that assumption about you, you know? So, I mean, I'd love to see if anyone puts in the chat message if they have some phrases as well. Do you guys think there's a difference between racism and colorism? And if so,
I think the last bit of the question got cut off, but
Oh.
the question was like racism and colorism.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, there definitely is, right? All of the isms. Well, I've got to be careful about that because when I was younger, someone was like, "Well, what about Buddhism? Is that bad?" It's like, no. So like isms rooted in oppression are different and play out differently, right? So racism is separate from sexism, separate from colorism. But like when we're talking about like skin tone, which is colorism, and race, which is like societally and politically constructed. It's not real, but it has real impacts, right? Those are different. Within racial groups, colorism exists. And I think we've already talked about that. Outside of racial groups, colorism still exists, right? And so like, I definitely do think there is a difference. With colorism, it is like white is better and like everything darker is like less good. With race, white is better, and like I think it's hard to like say like, yeah, okay, maybe Black people are at the bottom, or like maybe it's Indigenous people are at the bottom, like, or maybe it's like people of Asian or like Latinx descent, right? Like it's hard to put that in a hierarchy, but like with colorism, it's very clear: white, dark.
Yeah.
I think I say this in workshops that I lead. Racism is a spectrum, and while racism and colorism are not necessarily the same, I think we need to think of them alongside each other, where racism is a spectrum, and I think there are different umbrellas that live along that spectrum. And I think colorism sits there, and under these umbrellas are all different types of ways in which people can be microaggressive to lighter skinned people, to darker skinned people. And while I think we need to think of them in different ways, they need to live alongside each other. And we need to understand that being anti-racist also means being anti-colorist. And how do we do both of those things? How do we recognize the fact that racism is not just wearing a hood, or like you said, saying the N-word, or marching with the Proud Boys? It's a whole host of things that we need to work at, live within our consciousness, and recognize. And I think colorism exists as one of those ways in which we need to recognize how racism has affected our society across institutions.
Yeah, absolutely.
My thought on that just evolved just by the two of you talking. So I'm still working through it, but hopefully this will make sense. I think racism and colorism are tools that live in the ecosystem of white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what they are, point blank, period, because the end result of being a racist or the end result of being a colorist is lifting up whiteness.
Yeah. It's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
The term whiteness, if you guys ever look it up, or the history of white wasn't a term that was used to describe people until people moved to the US. Right? It's in American culture. Because if you were in Europe, you'd say, I'm Italian, I'm English, right? It was a way for consolidating a group of people together to create power pillars. So one example of colorism may be the abundance of skin lightening beauty products, such as those sold in Asia, India, and the Middle East. What role does intersectionality play in colorism globally, and how can we change this?
I think part of it, the how do we change it part, is the affirmation of people who are darker skinned for their beauty, yes, but also like their inherent worth as people, right? And their humanness. So like that's how we change it. And that looks like so many different ways. I don't know how to, I don't use skin lightening products, and I've never felt the need to. I know people who have, right? And I'm saddened that they feel the need to, but I'm also not going to tell that person, don't use skin lightening products, because there are real benefits to them that they can reap from that. I think there's like some internalized racism that they can work through, but I'm not going to tell someone not to use these products when the world around us tells us, if you are lighter, you will do better, you will go farther in society. I think the intersections play out in a lot of different ways, right? A lot more women use skin lightening products, right? Why is that? Because women are in society often more valued for their aesthetics than men are, right? And so like that is an intersection. We talked about like the intersection of race and color, right? Obviously, white people, they go the other way when it comes to colorism, right? Like they want to get to like this nice tan. So like white people like aren't really trying to use those kind of products, but people who are darker, different races, right, will use those. Those are some of the intersections that immediately come to mind. Oh, class as well, right? Somebody else can jump in on that one.
I think, I'm sorry.
No. Go right ahead.
I think I was like screaming. What comes up for me is when my mother went on a mission to Africa, and my mother is a little darker than me, and went with my aunt, who is probably this color, and how the locals of a particular village went up to my aunt wanting to touch her skin, how it was so beautiful, and my mother would talk about these creams that were essentially burning their skin. And I said to myself, why? And I think it's a couple of things. So the intersection around class and beauty, absolutely. But the remedy is representation, right? And I would say access to power. So seeing people of all colors, all hues being successful. So for me, as a brown woman in this country, I look and I'm overjoyed by the success of Lupita or Viola Davis, right?
Yeah.
And so I would say more of that. I love Michelle Obama. I do. Not about politics. There's a session for that, I'm sure, but about the fact that she is so strong in her Blackness, in my opinion, and she has my color skin, and it matters. I love that Amanda Gorman is this amazing artist, poet, savant, and she has two-strand twists. Things that I didn't see coming up as much. So I think the representation, and it doesn't get more powerful, at least in this country, than doing poetry during our Super Bowl, regardless of what you think about that, is critical to remedying the need to do things that are harmful to us, like burning our skin or our scalps, in pursuit of who we'll never be anyway. We'll never be that.
The media has to take a big responsibility in amplifying the beauty of darker skin and sort of reducing the impact of colorism, I think, is a big piece of this too, right?
Yeah. I have a thought based on what the both of you said. I don't know how to complete it. We love speaking in drafts, but I think it's so interesting, the juxtaposition, right, of white people wanting to darken their skin while seeing Black people wanting to lighten their skin. I just think that's such an interesting, and yet Black people are still looked upon as subhuman. And so I just find that very interesting. In terms of the intersection, I think if we look at ourselves and as more than color, I think of these intersections and I think of our social locations, right? Not just our race, ethnicity, but our gender identity, our class, how we grew up, what our environments were like. Thinking about Viola Davis, it makes me so angry that people call her the Black Meryl Streep. She's Viola Davis. She's not the Black anything. She's Viola Davis. I was
end of sentence, full stop.
Period. You know what I mean? It's like, it's just so fascinating to me that we need to classify people by the color of their skin. And I think we need to look at ourselves as more than color. I think we need to look at a human being and not just assume, okay, well, their color of skin is this, so I think this about them. They look this way, so I think they love this type of person. I don't know why we're so obsessed with that. Who people love, how they're having sex, what their color defines about who they are. I think we need to look at ourselves and constantly fight against the need to classify upon first appearances. What does it look like to think of someone more than the color of their skin? And how can you make that real and tangible for yourself? And how do you utilize that in your everyday? How do you clock the moments where, even as a person of color, you're like, oh, that was bias. I was colorist. Now, how could I have actively worked against that? Now, how can I do that in the future and inspire others to do the same? I think there can't be diversity, inclusion, equity, that we can't talk about any of these things without putting them in tandem with social justice and making change in the world and wanting to create the world that we wish to see. If we just talk in circles around it and never actually create actionable steps to make it happen, we're just going to stay in this cyclical rabbit hole forever and ever and ever. Yeah.
I know I highlighted this a little while ago, but what's your response when you hear people say, I'm colorblind or I don't see color? And I'll tell you what I think. When somebody says, I don't see color, the first thing that pops in my head is maybe you should get some glasses. eyesight issues, right? But what do you what do you feel when they say that?
If you don't see color, you don't see me.
Yeah.
You know, I remember at the beginning of the Summer of Reckoning, and so many of my white friends, you know, love you all if you're listening, but I got so many messages from people who I hadn't heard from in months, who felt like they needed to reach out, saying, you know, I just wanted to let you know I see you. I hear you. I love you. And while I appreciate that so much, you know, that means a lot for people to feel the need to reach out. But if you felt the need to reach out and tell me that you see me, did you ever see me at all?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is good that people are making active efforts to change, you know, and that is a positive step. But you do bring up a really good point.
Well, yeah, it's great that people are making active efforts, but like, why are you telling me about it? Just be about it, right? Right? Like words are cheap. Like show me with your day-to-day lives. When I think about that, it's a very similar thing that like, and like not to like lean on like an ableist joke, right? So like I'm not going to try to like come up with like a snappy metaphor for like vision, but it is about this idea of like, I challenge you to think about like when we think of like beautiful woman, who comes to mind? What race are they? Or like when you think of like doctor, who comes to mind? What race are they? What gender are they? Right? You have biases. Like nobody's saying that anybody shouldn't be biased. We're all biased. It's about how we work within those biases to work towards equity, not towards more oppression.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you bring up good points. How you apply those biases, right? In the right situations.
I think sorry.
Saying your thoughts?
When someone says I'm colorblind, I love all people, or some string of consciousness like that, what I think about is how unaware they must be. How just completely unaware, especially now if they're saying that. And for me, there is a part of me that feels some empathy for that. But there's also a part of me that's disappointed in that because their lack of awareness is very comfortable and convenient.
Yeah.
That's what comes up for me, honestly.
It's a privilege to be unaware.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Multiracial Americans are growing at a rate of 3 times as fast as the population as a whole. According to the Pew Research, what impact do you think this will have on the prevalence of colorism in the future?
I can start. I'm actually in a multiracial household, multicultural. So I am Black and American, and the love of my life is European and French. And so we are living through the impact as a couple that this office looks at the Capitol. So the impacts that I'm seeing are a couple of things. I am watching him have conversations, very uncomfortable conversations with his family that probably wouldn't have taken place before because it was convenient. It was comfortable to not talk about the elephant in the room that everyone sees, but it doesn't impact me directly, so I can just push it over to the side.
Yeah.
I also see it in another way, in how people respond to us. And this is in the nation's capital, but also when we decided to take a trip to, I'll just say somewhere in Virginia. And I think how we express our love and respect for each other is the impetus for people who are uncomfortable by us to think differently. Because there are, to your point, the data shows more and more multiracial couples, and minority is no longer going to apply. And so I feel daily that this thought, this need to be introspective, to check my bias, to delve into even what privilege is happening even more so, just by we love each other.
Yeah, I love that.
We will soon, I bristle at the term minority, right? My friends Tiffany Jewell and Britt Hawthorne, and I don't know where they got this, but they use the word people of the global majority, right? To say minority is to center whiteness, right? And there are more non-white people in the world than there are so in the US, white people are for now the majority, but that's not what it is across the world, right? And just to use that frame is to center whiteness and put whiteness as supreme, and that's not what we're trying to do. As a biracial child myself, one who is not white at all, right? One of the things that you struggle with is being called exotic, right? Or I'm also because I'm biracial, of course, any relationship I'm going to be in is also a multicultural relationship, but my wife is Salvadoran. And so we talk about how our children have so much more work to do as multi-ethnic people to be rooted in their own identity and proud of their identities and not assimilate into the culture of whiteness. I don't think it's an automatic thing that just because people come from multiple heritages that they will be strong and rooted in those and not assimilate into whiteness. Yes, there's going to be more visibility. Yes, there's going to be more presence. But when the culture of white supremacy is rooted in every institution, like Dimitri said, it's really hard unless you're making a conscious effort to be rooted in your identity, be proud of who you are, knowing your history, knowing who you are, being proud of that, right? And not buckling, not caving, not cowering in the face of whiteness. There is so much more work to do, because oftentimes when there are interracial marriages, right, the children, the offspring, myself, right, are lighter than one parent, right? And so that's moving closer to whiteness if we allow it to be. How can we make sure that you're rooted in your identity as a person, and the stories of the ancestors and the history of all the people who've come before you to bring you to where you are today? It's not an automatic thing that multi-ethnic babies are going to eliminate racism.
Yeah.
And
I think this generation they're getting information much better than we did when we were growing up. And I think that hope gives me an idea that they'll be more open-minded to embracing their own identities through experiences.
I hope a more multicultural United States also leads to less assimilation policy. I think about France and how they literally have an assimilation policy for non-French people. And that deeply affects the Muslim community in France. And, now they're going back and forth on this long-standing, generations-old policy that is so rooted in French culture and what it means to be French, is now being challenged, because that homogenous society is now turning into a multicultural society at rates that are just, they can't keep up. And so I think we also have to look at what are the policies that have been created to almost de facto force people into assimilating to a society or a culture in order to feel like they belong. So many of us live in the diaspora, and so many of us feel like we need to assimilate to American culture. And I'm so grateful that my parents fought against that. My mom was so adamant on my brother and me embracing what it means to be Haitian, getting to learn how to speak French, my PWIs, and come back home to a family that is so deeply rooted in pride for what it means to be Haitian. And so I think we also need to look at how not only can we be cultural, how can we be more culturally competent, but also how can we start to create real change in policy that doesn't make people feel like they need to assimilate or need to be a certain type of person in order to have power or in order to feel belonged, like they belong.
No, definitely. What are some steps that individuals can take to check their biases that are tied to colorism? Do you have any pointers for the group, for the audience? Melva, you want to go first?
Not really, but we'll try it.
I can jump in if you want.
What did you say, David?
I was saying I can jump in if you want a little bit more.
Go for it.
Yeah. So I mean, so checking your bias, checking your privilege, right? That's first taking inventory of yourself, who you are, all the intersections of your identity, not just race, not just color. But since we're talking specifically about that, like where you stand, how that benefits you, and how you're harmed by that. What is your proximity to whiteness, and how you've been able to navigate the world? Like this is internal work for external impact. It's a lot of the work that we do with Amplify RJ, with restorative justice being this way of repairing harm, but also proactively building and repairing relationships, right? But the first relationship that you have is the relationship with yourself. So like, what is the internalized messages that you have about color and race? And we can talk about like all other types of oppression as well. But when we're talking about color and race, it's those questions of like, where am I? How do I benefit? How am I harmed? How do I continue to uphold these oppressive systems? Like, those are the questions to ask.
I love it.
And I feel like for people who are listening, those questions are not rhetorical. You can actually like maybe like get a notebook and like legitimately write things down for yourself and document and codify that, so you can look back at the work that you've done and where you were and where you are now. And if you have a goal to be less biased, and as that relates to colorism, you can look back at the goals you set for yourself and the ways in which you saw yourself in proximity to whiteness. If it's been a month, if it's been 2 months, how has that work been for you? Has anything changed? If it hasn't changed, what can you do to make that change? How are you doing your own research besides joining this LinkedIn Live, because we're just scratching the surface? And do research and look at how colorism affects not just us in the US, but in the world. And how can you bring that knowledge to other people who may not have that knowledge? Relational organizing, having conversations, especially with people that we trust, people that we love, I think is a great way at, in your day-to-day, if you don't know, if you feel like this thing is such a lofty thing to deal with, you can find little micro actions in your day-to-day that will make a big difference.
The only thing I'll add to that, and thank you, David, for the prompt, is storytelling. So I have been journaling since I was 7 years old, that 7-year-old who was bald and confused and angry and all of the things, right? And I've kept that journal. I probably journal 4 nights a week about who I want to become, what I've learned, what I'm grateful for. And as I've gotten older, I have found my people where we can share stories.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
We can share stories of the impact, since we're talking about colorism. Yes, we can share stories of how our race has affected our work. And in that interaction, I found it wasn't validation, but affirmation that the journey I'm on to be who I am, even though it's different than what the majority might say I should be, was right. And so I encourage people, when you journal, to share your story with your people, whoever they are, and bring others along. Yeah. Share them with people who are younger than you. Part of the reason why I don't have children, we don't have children, but we do have a lot of mentees. And I think the reason why young ladies gravitate to me is I'm not afraid to say, look, it wasn't Now I'm bold and crazy and I'll say whatever I want. I shouldn't say crazy, that's not kind, but I'm very much myself.
Yeah.
But 20 years ago, it wasn't like that. And here's what I experienced.
No, I love that. I think the strength and vulnerability that you mentioned before, the storytelling, the self-reflection you guys all spoke about, I think those are the keys to making change happen that's lasting. I always say, if you want to change the world, you want to change your community, you want to change your work environment, you want to change your family dynamic, it starts with changing yourself, and that becomes contagious. You know,
And I think too, for people of color who are watching, as these experiences occur and as you're taking stock of that for yourself, and I think it's important that when you are harmed in those moments, don't dehumanize yourself. Don't allow that to happen. Take stock of that and have a conversation with yourself. But I think it's really important to not dehumanize yourself.
Absolutely. Guys, this is great. Melva, thank you so much. David, thank you so much. Dimitri, it was such an interesting conversation. I hope people took away a lot of action items from this, especially around activism. We definitely should do this again. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.